I'm Virginia Shearer. I'm the Associate Chair of Education here at the museum, and it's my privilege to organize these programs. It's also a privilege and an honor for me to get to work with our speaker, David Brenneman. David Brenneman has been the Francis B. Bunzel Family Curator of European Art at the High Museum of Art since 1995. In September 2006, he was appointed Director of Collections and Exhibitions while retaining his responsibilities as Chief Curator and Curator of European Art. A very busy job here at the High, as you can expect. He's organized numerous exhibitions, which many of us have gotten to see, including Toulouse-Lautrec posters and prints from the collection of Irene and Howard Stein in 1997, Monet and Bazille, a collaboration in 1999, Degas in America, The Early Collectors in 2001, Monet, A View from the River in 2001, Paris in the Age of Impressionism in 2002, and Van Gogh to Mondrian, Modern Art from the Muller Museum in 2004. He's been very busy. He is currently managing curator of the High Museum's 3-year collaboration with the Musée du Louvre. And before arriving in Atlanta, he held fellowships at the Museum of Art of the Rhode Island School of Art of Design and the Fogg Art Museum at Harvard University. From 1993 to 1995, he was assistant curator of paintings at the Yale Center for British Art in New Haven, Connecticut, where he specialized in 18th and early 19th century paintings. David received his BA from the Pennsylvania State University and his PhD in art history from Brown. Thank you so much for coming out tonight, and without further ado, David Brenneman.
Thank you, Virginia. I appreciate that. And thank you for coming out this evening on one of the very last evenings that we will have Inspiring Impressionism in Atlanta. It will shortly be packed up and trucked out to Denver, to the Denver Art Museum, where it will have its next showing. And then after Denver, it travels on to the Seattle Art Museum. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to talk about an artist that I very much have grown to love and to think about a lot, and that is Claude Monet. And my interest in Monet really goes back to my undergraduate days at Penn State and then my graduate days at Brown University, where I studied with someone named Kermit Champa, who was a renowned Impressionist scholar. He had written a book called Studies in Early Impressionism, and he was a brilliant lecturer. If you attended courses at Brown that he taught, you would literally have to sit in the aisles because they were absolutely packed. And he really inspired me to think more deeply about Impressionism. And he was aware that one of the major acquisitions at the High Museum that I had participated in was the painting that is on the wall right now, which is a painting by Claude Monet. We acquired it in 2001, I think, or maybe 2000. Time is flying. And for me, it was a remarkable achievement, both professionally, but also as someone who loves this museum and this community. So it's a painting that when I was sitting down with colleagues from Denver and Seattle and really thinking about this exhibition, Inspiring Impressionism, it's a painting that I really wanted to get into the exhibition. But as we started to think about the exhibition and think about the Impressionists and the old masters that inspired them, I had a bit of a problem thinking about Monet and talking about Monet, because he is the one Impressionist artist who I think tried to distance himself the farthest from the old masters. And he is the one, I think, Impressionist, when you look at his work, you think, how could this artist have really studied the old masters or incorporated any lessons that he might have learned into his own work, because his work looks so modern and so different. But I was able to convince my colleagues, and the painting is in the exhibition. And so I want to take this opportunity this evening of maybe hoping that I can convince you that perhaps Monet wasn't as distanced from the old masters as he and his supporters might have wanted us to believe. As I said, of the Impressionists, Monet was one of the most vocal in his dissociation with the art of the past. And there's a very famous incident, which I'm going to relate to you now. And I'm going to put the first slide on. There's a very famous incident around this painting, which is currently at Oberlin College in Oberlin, Ohio, in the Museum of Art there. And it involves Monet as a very young artist. He started to really learn to paint in the late 1850s. He went to Paris. And then there was a brief stint in the military where he was sent to North Africa. He was sort of bought out of the military. He had a horrible time, bought out of the military by his wealthy aunt. And he comes back to Paris, and he goes into the studio of an established painter named Charles Gleyre, along with a couple of other Impressionist artists, Renoir, and another artist named Basile. And he goes in, and Gleyre is an artist who, while teaching traditional methods, is very encouraging of artists going out and studying from nature. And so Monet realizes that one of the things that young artists were supposed to do was to go into the Louvre and copy old master paintings. And so he gets his copyist's pass, and he takes his easel and his paints and his canvas into the museum, and he walks right past all of the old master paintings. He walks out onto the balcony of one of the windows of the Louvre, and he paints this view of Paris. And so you couldn't have any more of an explicit rejection of the old masters than that. But really the question is that all there is to be said about Monet and the old masters? Did he sneak a peek as he was walking past those old masters on his way to paint this really beautiful view, this very fresh view of Paris from the early 1860s? The story that Monet was telling about himself and his rejection of the old masters is also bolstered by the fact that there are no known copies by Monet after an old master painting. And if one of you happen to find one, please let me know. And this is also true of Camille Pissarro, who was another member of this Impressionist group and an early friend of Monet's. And it was actually also Pissarro who wanted to burn the Louvre to the ground. So why would they have wanted to do this? Why were they so hostile to the art of the past? One of the founding myths of modernism, of modern art, is that in order to make something new, you have to break completely with the past. And this is actually a myth that persists to the present day. Both Monet and Pissarro believed in this myth, as did many of the patrons and the critics who supported them and who bought their work. In the 20th century, there have been many attempts by scholars to connect the Impressionists with modern art movements of more recent times. Monet's late paintings, and I show you here a painting, late painting of water lilies, also called this type of painting is called a nymphaeus painting. There was a lily pond at his home at Giverny, and he made a number of these paintings, and they're characterized by many of them by their very large scale. If you've seen some of these, for example, if you've seen the one at the Museum of Modern Art, it's very wide. It's a very big painting. And they're also characterized by these gestural marks, these gestural brushstrokes, the way that Monet creates the water lilies, the leaves of the water lilies. If you get a little bit close, you'll see that they're just these very broad sort of circular gestures. And so in the 20th century, there have been attempts by scholars to connect this kind of work with this kind of work. And so the paintings don't look alike, but they are similar in that you're talking about, and this is a work at the Museum of Modern Art by Jackson Pollock, and that's a very big, wide canvas, very large, 10 or 12 feet wide, and it's covered with these gestural markings. Of course, Pollock laid his canvases on the ground and dripped on them. But again, there is this similarity of scale and this gestural marking that scholars and critics attempted to connect with the work of the late Claude Monet. So they've wanted to see Monet's work as forward-looking, not backward-looking. So another aspect of modernism and wanting to see Monet as a modern artist. He wasn't someone, again, who looked at the art of the past, but who looked forward. And therefore, Monet is presented in a number of exhibitions. There was one recently in Boston, I mean recently within the last 5 years or so, and at the Royal Academy in London, called Monet in the 20th Century, which again attempted to cement this reputation for Monet as a pioneer of modern art, of 20th century art. But, as with any myth, the closer you look, the more questions that arise. Can an artist completely dissociate himself or herself from the art of previous generations? And having thought about this quite a bit, my conclusion is no, that artists cannot and do not dissociate themselves completely with the art of the past and the art of previous generations. And there are a number of reasons for that, and those reasons, I think, will come out in the course of my remarks. And then another question, well, if Monet did glean something from the old masters, what was it? Can I show you what it was? Well, I'm going to try to do that. In the Inspiring Impressionism exhibition, which I hope you've all seen, and if you haven't seen it, the show is here till Sunday, and the museum is also open till 8 p.m. tonight, so I'll try to finish up so that if you would like to go see the exhibition, you'll have the opportunity to do that. But in the show, there are sort of three old master revivals that took place in the 19th century that are illustrated in the exhibition. And those revivals happened for various reasons. They happened for political reasons, for social reasons, for kind of taste reasons. But they were a revival of Spanish art of the 17th century, so the art of Velázquez and artists like Murillo. There was a real taste, a growth in taste in the 19th century for that work. French 18th century art, which is also known as Rococo art. There was a revival of interest in that period in the 19th century. And then also Dutch painting of the 17th century, so Dutch painting of the age of Rembrandt. There was a revival at the end of the 19th century there too. So let's look at Monet in relation to these three revivals and see, in fact, if there is any connections to be made between his art and the art of the past and the art of those three areas. So first we're going to look at Monet and Spanish painting. And I think that this, of the three revivals that I just mentioned, Spanish painting, Dutch painting, and French Rococo painting, this was probably the one where I would say the connection is the thinnest. However, I still think there's a connection. And what I have on the screen right now for you is a comparison of two portraits. One is a self-portrait. The portrait on the left is a self-portrait of Velázquez, which is currently in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. And the portrait on the right is by one of Monet's earliest teachers, someone named Carlos Duran. And it's actually a portrait of the very young Monet, painted in the late 1850s. Now, it's not a self-portrait, but nevertheless, it shows the young Monet in the late 1850s depicted as an old master, almost depicted like Velázquez depicted himself. And so that's not to say that Monet himself saw himself as an old master, but it's to say that he was in this circle of people in Paris who, again, drank deeply of the old masters, who sort of reprocessed them and rechanneled them, and that he was part of this milieu, this circle. So he was aware. He knew that you were supposed to look at the old masters, that you were supposed to study them and supposed to absorb them and transform them and make something new in your own work. So when we look at some later paintings, so we would look at this painting, which was just recently revealed in the renovated galleries of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York by Monet. It's a picture showing his son, Jean, who's in the garden, who's riding a hobby horse. And it's a really remarkable picture. It was part of the Annenberg gift to the Metropolitan Museum, and I don't think it's been seen a lot. So I hope for those of you who go to New York that you'll take a look at the Metropolitan's new galleries. But it's a really very charming portrait. And so when you look at the seemingly straightforward, modern portrait of a young boy on a hobby horse, you may not necessarily think of this painting, which is a portrait of Prince Baltasar Carlos, who was a prince of Spain. It's a painting by Velázquez, done in the first part of the 17th century. But I think that nevertheless, if you're painting a portrait of a young boy on a horse, regardless of the fact that it's a hobby horse as opposed to a real horse, I think there is something to the fact that this painting by Velázquez was somewhere in the visual memory of Monet when he went to paint the portrait of his son. Now, one of the reasons that Spanish painting, I think, did not have a huge effect on Monet is that after about 1870, Monet pretty much turned away from the painting of the human figure and pretty much exclusively focused on the landscape. And so the Spanish tradition, the Spanish 17th century tradition, was a figurative tradition of painting. It was a tradition of painting that focused on the human body and on history and myth. And so it wouldn't have been something that would have appealed to or been useful to a landscape painter. Now, Monet did travel to Spain later in his life when he was more successful around 1900. He acquired a car, an automobile, and he had a driver, and he had his driver take him to Spain. So we know that he visited Spain and saw the Prado and other museums. But again, I don't see the influence of that trip as really having anything to do with his later landscape practice. I think he just did it for his own enjoyment. Now we turn to the Dutch 17th century painters. These were painters who, the best-known names are, of course, Rembrandt and Vermeer and Hals, but there were a whole group of landscape painters who were quite amazing painters, and their names are maybe less recognizable, but one of them was a family called the Ruysdael family, or Ruysdael family. And they were excellent painters, and one of them, Solomon Ruysdael, focused on what we call in the field riverbank paintings. So these are paintings that depict activities that happened along the rivers and estuaries in the lowlands, in the Netherlands and in Holland. And here you see a couple of very typical features of these types of paintings. Well, first of all, it's typical that it's a riverbank painting. There was a lot of water in the Netherlands, so hence riverbank activities. You see this little boat over here with an activity happening here, and a boat over here. I don't know if you can quite see that. And then a boat in the distance in full sail. And then another feature of this kind of painting is this low horizon line, which is typical of Dutch painting. And it's typical because Holland and the lowlands have a very low horizon. It's a very flat country. And so the emphasis in this painting, the sky, which takes up about 2/3, maybe a little bit more of the painting, receives a lot of emphasis. And of course, the Dutch were some of the first to go out and to record natural effects. And they were some of the first to go out and really study cloud formations. And so when you look at Dutch 17th century paintings, you should really look at the cloud formations because these were really important to the artists who made them. and they were very, very good at it. It also allowed artists to show their skill, because clouds are very transitory, moving, ephemeral things, and so if you can paint clouds, then you must be pretty good. Now, this type of painting, 17th century Dutch painting, was really kind of not very well regarded in the 18th and early 19th century, in part because it was too simple. It was just like, why should we really pay a lot of money for or think a lot about these paintings that are just of everyday, common, droll subjects? And so in terms of museums, in terms of art collections, this kind of painting was really not deemed to be the highest form of landscape painting. Nevertheless, in the late 19th century, when you have the rise of the middle class in France, there's a kind of, which kind of mirrored the rise of the middle class in Holland and the Netherlands in the 17th century. Like in Holland of the 17th century, there is a similar interest at the end of the 19th century in landscape, in things that everyone can appreciate. You can hang in your living room, your dining room, and you can just enjoy as you relax in your home. And so because the Dutch had been so successful at it, these became a model for French painters in the late 19th century. And not only that, people also began to collect these paintings in the late 19th century. So if you were a French painter and you're thinking about how do I sell landscape paintings, well, maybe if I make my painting kind of look like a Dutch painting, it'll be more attractive to a prospective buyer. And of course Monet, but particularly dealers, knew this, and when they were encouraging artists, as Monet was encouraged, they said, if you want to sell your paintings, paint riverbank scenes and paint scenes that remind people of these leisure activities and of this 17th century Dutch tradition. So we think, in fact, that's what happened when Claude Monet fled Paris with his young family in 1870. There was a war. France was at war with Prussia. And he went to London, and there he met a very important dealer named Paul Durand-Ruel, who was a great supporter of the Impressionists. And it was probably Durand-Ruel who said, paint paintings that look like Dutch landscapes, because that's the kind of painting that I can sell. And so, interestingly, as the war had ended, Monet does not go directly back to Paris. He makes a side trip to Amsterdam and to a little area outside of Amsterdam called Zaandam. And there he makes 24, we think about 24 paintings, and there are actually two of them in the exhibition, two of the 24 paintings that he made. So he stops there, he lives there for a few months, and he writes to his friend Pissarro, who had also gone to England, gone into exile in England. He says that the town of Zaandam offered everything that he could want. Houses of all colors, windmills by the hundreds, and enchanting boats. There is enough to paint here for a lifetime. And he says to Pissarro that he wants to work and make landscape paintings, make paintings, before he visits the great museums in Amsterdam, which he eventually does get around to before he goes to back to Paris. So he paints this work, and then he paints this work, which I think represents some of the buildings, the area around where he lived with his young family, and then this work as well. And you can see, if I actually go back, can I go back? There we go, and go back one more. And I think you can also see this in the paintings that are in the galleries. Again, I'll just point out what relates this to Dutch painting of the 17th century, but you're probably already seeing this. Look at the horizon line. It's down there. It's about a third, maybe a little less than a third of the painting. Also subjects. What kind of subjects? Sailboats, activities along the riverbank. And then also these wonderful cloud effects. So he makes these paintings, he gets back to Paris, and then in 1873, his friend Paul Durand-Ruel, his dealer, says, okay, I'll sell some of these paintings for you. And so he produces this deluxe catalog of his inventory of paintings. And in them, he includes several of Monet's works. And so this is one of the works that in fact, was for sale by Paul Durand-Ruel, the dealer who had encouraged Monet to paint in this Dutch manner. And of course, the painting that he chooses to illustrate in his sales catalog is one of these Dutch scenes that Monet had just produced a year or two earlier. Now, Monet apparently really liked the lowlands. He really liked Amsterdam, and he returned there twice after that. So in 1871, he was there. He went back in 1875 and also in 1886. And on one of his return trips, this is the one about 1875, he painted more views. And this is actually a painting that's in the exhibition. It's a really beautiful work from 1875 from the Philadelphia Museum. And it shows a canal in Paris, in Amsterdam, not Paris, I love Paris, and then a church, and then this wonderful bridge. And this particular church is one that had been painted by artists of previous generations. And I'll show you another painting which is in the exhibition, which is this painting by Meindert Hobema, who was another of these 17th century Dutch landscape painters. So in this case, you have Monet actually going to a site that had been painted by these 17th century painters and redoing it. Now, of course, if we go back to the Monet painting, again, this doesn't look like a 17th century Dutch painting. It's got a much higher keyed color palette. The brushwork is applied in a much more sketchy and loose fashion. But nevertheless, Monet had to have known that this particular site was painted by these 17th century Dutch painters, and he may even have suspected that collectors would know this as well. And of course, if you're a painter or any artist, you have to sell your work to make a living. So we've seen the Spanish and the Dutch, and now we move to Monet and the 18th century French Rococo. And this was a kind of art, the Rococo period was a kind of art that really flourished about 100 years before the Impressionists. So during the first part of the 18th century, from about 1710 or thereabouts to about 1750 or 60 or thereabouts. And the Impressionist movement really began in the late 1860s and went through to the end of the 19th century, so about 1900 or thereabouts. And the Rococo period was one that particularly fascinated not only artists but writers. There was a very famous brother team of writers, the Goncourt brothers, who actually wrote a book about 18th century painters. And one of the things that they really liked about it was the sort of the ease of this period in history, the way that people lived. And so when you have a painter like Renoir, and this is a work that's in the exhibition, Renoir starts out early in his career as a porcelain painter, as a painter on porcelains. And so he's someone who really looks at porcelain, earlier porcelains, particularly of the 18th century when porcelain was really at its height. And he's someone who immediately becomes infatuated with the 18th century. In fact, he says in 1885, he could more readily imagine himself in a Watteau landscape than in reality. And Watteau, of course, was one of the great painters of the Rococo period. And Renoir was a good friend of Monet. So I think it's probably natural that in the late 1860s, early 70s, when Renoir is so fascinated with the 18th century, that some of that should rub off on his good friend Monet. The kinds of paintings that these artists were looking at are paintings like this by an artist named Huet. This is also in the exhibition. And they're characterized, these 18th century paintings are characterized by these sort of rural scenes of amorous relationships. And so here you see a couple in a landscape. She is supposed to be, I think, sleeping, but who knows. And then this young lad is kind of sneaking up on her. And this is a very sort of common subject of the period. And the type of painting is known as the subject is known as a fête galante. It's a kind of a gallant encounter. And sometimes they take the form of just two people in a landscape having this amorous encounter. And sometimes there are whole parties happening in the landscape. So when you have two artists, the painting on the left is in the exhibition. The painting on the right, unfortunately, is not in the exhibition. The painting on the left is by Berthe Morisot, another of the Impressionist group. The painting on the right is by Monet, and we actually thought it was coming to Atlanta. It was coming from a German museum, but it turned out that the work was not coming. It was actually promised to another exhibition. So it's one that we would have loved to have had here. But again, you see this sort of figures in the landscape sort of lounging. And here it's not an amorous encounter. It's probably a mother and a daughter, or maybe an older sister and a younger sister. But again, there's this leisure, this leisure that's happening in the landscape, which the Impressionists also saw in the late 19th century, saw around them every day. This is a painting by an 18th century painter, a Rococo painter named Pater, and this was in the first year of our Louvre Atlanta partnership. And it's a big painting. This is one of those fêtes galantes that I was mentioning, this sort of gallant feast. And you see this party in the landscape, and again, you see this kind of interaction, and there's conversation going on between men and women, and everybody's having a very good time. And this dog looks like it's waiting for a handout here. And so then when an artist like Monet goes to create what he thinks will be his first major composition, which is called the Luncheon in the Grass, it was never realized. This sketch is what remains, and it's in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. But you see he arranges the figures again as a kind of party in the landscape. And I think pretty clearly was looking back at the earlier example of artists like Watteau and Pater. And then paintings like this, which is in the Walters Art Gallery, where again you see this figure seated in the landscape. And then finally, I thought I would show you this wonderful example where you have, it's not landscape, but it's a still life, and you have on the left, these paintings are not in the exhibition. This is a painting by Monet, and this is a painting by Chardin. And so here you see Monet painting this wonderful cylinder of fruit, probably in some kind of liqueur. And then over here you see this painting by Chardin, which includes this bottle of olives. And again, I'm sure that Monet saw this actual jar of fruit, or brandied fruit, but at the same time, in choosing such a subject, I think he must have known of this earlier tradition and of the work of artists like Chardin, who were masters of still life, and who would have been known as masters of still life to artists like Monet as he passed through the galleries of the Louvre, not looking at anything. So what I really want to get to, and I think kind of conclude with, are Monet and the Claudian landscape tradition. And I think this was really the tradition that most deeply influenced Monet over his entire career. And you can see the influence of Claude in early paintings by Monet as well as late paintings by Monet. And Monet died, I think, in 1926 or thereabouts. So you see it in works up until almost his death. And what I mean by the Claudian tradition is that there was a way of making landscapes, of building landscapes, that had been invented by a 17th century French painter named Claude Lorrain. He was an artist who spent a lot of time in Italy, and so his subjects tend to be of classical themes. So whether they're historical themes or made-up themes or themes of nymphs, the place where these take place, where they're painted, is in Italy. And what makes a Claudian landscape? How does he build his landscapes? Well, one of the things that he does is he creates balance. And he creates balance by dividing the picture up into balanced parts. And so one of the things that defines a Claudian landscape is that, I don't know if you remember when I talked about Dutch painting, the horizon line being down here. Well, in a Claudian landscape, it's almost always right in the middle. So it divides the sky from the bottom half of the painting, and both take up equal parts. And here you can see it's a little bit covered up, but you can see the sky sort of comes down to here, and then the land, the foreground is down here. The other thing that Claude does is that he likes to balance the paintings from side to side. So he always puts sort of framing elements, whether they're trees or buildings, here, and he'll put trees and buildings over here. And also, usually, there's some kind of, there are little figures, some kind of action happening in the foreground. So Claude is the master of this tradition. The structure essentially creates the French classical landscape. And it's a tradition that's very much in force in the 19th century. And if you look at an earlier 19th century artist named Camille Corot, who was very much admired by Monet and who tried to get Monet's paintings accepted by the Salon in 1860s when other judges wanted to reject him. You see in Corot, you also see the tradition, the continuing of this Claudian tradition. So this is one of Corot's most famous paintings. It's in the Musée du Louvre. It's called Souvenir of Fontana. It's a memory of this place called Fontana. And again, one of the things that defines it is sort of, well, here it's a little bit lower, not the perfect example, but this kind of balance from here to here, and then also the use of these framing elements. And one of the things that I think actually enhances the balance here is the reflection of these trees in the water, this sense of bilateral symmetry. There's something that should take you back to high school biology class. Okay. And then this is another painting by Corot where he's actually going to a riverbank theme, which is kind of interesting. So perhaps there's a little bit of Dutch influence in this painting as well. So in 1872, I guess, Monet returns to France. He's just painted all of these riverbank scenes in Holland. And he's come back to France, and he lives in Paris for a little while, but I think finds it very depressing because it's been destroyed by the war with the Prussians. And so where does he decide to live? Well, he decides to live in a little suburb outside of Paris on a river called Argenteuil. It was actually on the Seine River. And a good choice for Claude because the subjects there are river, people sailing on the river, and the kinds of subjects that people want to buy. So he's made friends. He's taken the advice of Paul Durand-Ruel, the dealer in Paris, and he's there happily painting it at Argenteuil, and he's sending these paintings back to Paris, and Durand-Ruel is selling them. And so suddenly, whereas Monet had been struggling and impoverished, he's making good money. And so I love this painting, which is not by Monet. It's actually a painting by Renoir of Monet smoking and reading a book. I love this painting because it's the picture of contentedness. My guess is, I'm fantasizing, I know, he's just had a meal. He's lit up the old pipe, and he's reading a book that must have just completely enthralled him. But it's the picture of contentedness, and his content comes from the fact that he has been able to make and sell a lot of paintings of the riverbank of this place, Argenteuil. So that is where our painting was made, the High Museum's painting, which I opened the talk with, which was done in Argenteuil in about 1873. Now, please note that the painting is dated 1874, and some of you might be able to see that, but if you go up and see the painting in the flesh, you'll be able to see that date. Monet frequently didn't date his paintings, and then sometimes he went back and dated them, and we think that he actually made a mistake when he dated this painting. And artists do this; they make mistakes. So again, we have this painting of a riverbank, and in the exhibition, we have the painting in proximity to two Dutch paintings that he had made a year or two before. But what's interesting, I learn a lot when I go into our own exhibitions. And one of the things that I immediately thought when I saw this painting is it doesn't look like a Dutch riverbank scene. Even though it is a riverbank, and even though you have these wonderful trees by the side and you have these little boats here, it doesn't look like a Dutch painting. And why doesn't it look like a Dutch painting? Well, if you look at how the composition is structured, you see that you have the line going almost in the middle of the painting, and then you see the balance and the bilateral symmetry of the reflection. And so in structure, it's much more of a French classical composition. It's much more related to the tradition of Claude Lorrain. So it's possible that he had been in the lowlands, in the Netherlands, and he painted in a Dutch mode, and then when he got back to France, he decided to paint in a French classical mode. But in any case, in either mode, he was painting in a mode of older landscape painting, and that's really my main point. Okay. Now, interestingly, for those of you who saw the Monet A View from the River exhibition a few years ago, he reprises this riverbank theme in the 1890s. Oh, this, by the way, is a really extraordinarily beautiful painting which we borrowed for that show a number of years ago. It's now in the Courtauld Institute in London, and if you ever get to London, you need to see this painting. It's the sort of sister to our painting, which is much more peaceful. This is much more kind of animated, but the two paintings are identical in scale, and I really see them as sort of twins in a way. Not twins, but brothers and sisters, I guess. So this is a painting from the 1890s. This is a work done sort of near the back end, the back nine of Monet's career. And again, he returns to the riverbank, and again, these are more, paintings are more square in format. And you see this line going through the middle, you see the bilateral symmetry, and then you see this kind of recession of almost like the sides of a stage moving back into the stage-like space. So even into the 1890s, he's continues to have deep within him this classical landscape structure that can be traced back to the work of Claude Lorrain. And one of these paintings, I don't know if it's this one or this one, is in the collection. One of them is at the Amherst College Museum, the Mead Art Museum, and the other one is at the North Carolina Museum at Raleigh. So if you're in North Carolina, I would encourage you to stop by and see these works, or see this one work. So one of the things that I think even Monet must have had in the back of his mind, even as he was rejecting the art of the past, even as he was slinking by the old masters as he was walking through the galleries of the Louvre to get onto the balcony, is that, artists think a lot about where their work is going to end up, where their work is going to be seen, and who is going to see it. And one of the places, if you were a French artist in the late 19th century, one of the places that you might have wanted your work to be seen is in the Musée du Louvre, right? And in fact, his predecessor, Corot, whom he very much admired, that painting that I showed you before, the Souvenir of Fontana, in fact, was purchased by the state and now hangs in the galleries of the Louvre. So one thought that I would leave you with is that even while Monet rejected the Impressionists, I think he was dreaming. I think he might have been dreaming about his paintings someday hanging in the galleries of the Musée du Louvre. Now, and some of them I think probably have done. For a number of years, the Impressionist paintings, the French Impressionist paintings, were in a small museum which was just outside of the Louvre, the Jeu de Paume, and now they actually hang in another museum just across the Seine River from the Louvre, the Musée d'Orsay. But I have to believe that thought must have crossed Monet's mind at one point in his career or another. I would encourage you, if you have not seen the Inspiring Impressionism exhibition, to go see it. I've just tried to give you a little bit of a taste of some things that, in fact, I've learned and thought about as a result of seeing the exhibition myself. And I just want to thank you for supporting the High Museum and for coming tonight and hearing me out. Thank you. And I guess I'll take some questions if you have them. But if you need to run and see those paintings, just run. Just go.
In this exhibition, some of the paintings are shown under glass and most are presented straight out, and I was never able to figure out which way you have to show them.
Okay, good question. Why are some paintings that we show under glass and why are other paintings not under glass? Glass is put over paintings to protect them, and in many cases it's a security requirement. And one of the stories that I will tell you, which I hope is relevant to your question, is that when we did an exhibition a number of years ago from the Kröller-Müller Museum, and there were a very good group of Van Gogh paintings in that exhibition, all of the Van Gogh paintings were under glass. And so I asked the curator, I said, could we actually show the paintings without the glass? And he said, look, you can put the best, most transparent glass on them, but they must be shown under glass, and I'll tell you why. A number of years ago, a tour group stopped by the Kröller-Müller Museum, and at the end of the tour, one of the ladies got onto the bus and said, look, I've got myself a piece of a Van Gogh painting. Oh my God. And so then some years later, a little anonymous letter arrived at the Kröller-Müller Museum with a fragment of a Van Gogh painting in it, saying, very sorry, we're returning this to you. And they didn't know they couldn't figure out where it was supposed to go. So they decided at that point that they would just simply put glass on all of the paintings, and that would protect from that kind of incident happening in the future. Keep in mind that Van Gogh paintings routinely go for $30, $40, $50 million a piece at auction, if you can buy one. Monet paintings now have reached up into the $20, $30 million range. So if you had an investment like that, what would you do? So, yes, Regine.
You showed those paintings an imitation of the Dutch paintings.
Yes.
But at the same time, as you mentioned, nobody would ever mistake them for Dutch painting. What about Chevreul's influence?
I didn't catch the name of the...
Chevreul,
the scientist, yeah. Well, I think it's a good question. The question was about the influence of sort of optical theory, I think, on the Impressionists. And there were a number of people at the end of the 19th century, a number of scientists. There was another scientist named Rood, who had come up, R-O-O-D, who had come up with ideas about color and perception. And absolutely, Monet and his circle at least were broadly familiar with these ideas. And one of the ideas that ultimately led to divisionism or pointillism is that when you have two colors, contrasting colors next to each other, as the eye moves back, it will blend those colors together. And so you don't have to physically blend them with a brush. You can just put them together and the eye will blend them. And I think definitely Monet knew that. I think Monet was also influenced by Japanese prints, which were very colorful and which presented to the Impressionists. Monet loved Japan. He collected them, and if you go to Giverny, his house now is covered with Japanese prints. But they loved to think about and to present color in a way that was very bright and very un-Old Masterly. Absolutely. And so, again, that sort of makes you think, how could this artist have learned anything from the old masters? And as I said, I'm not trying to convince you that he didn't, do those things, that he didn't make color, paint paint paintings that are absolutely fresh and new and vibrant. But what I am trying to indicate is that if you look at certain things and you look sort of beyond those things that we know about Monet and that make him modern, there are these hints, these echoes that I think suggest that there was more going on up there than meets the eye. Sorry.
I have
yes.
two questions, actually. How much of the return to the French landscape tradition that you showed in those waterfront, the riverfront
Yes.
paintings, how much of that could have been due to his returning to something he remembered in his brain when he could no longer see because of his cataracts? Because by 1910 he was basically blind.
Well, I think it's a good question. He was, many of the, for example, Degas also had major vision problems late in his career. But I think that the paintings that I showed, the Riverbank scenes, were actually made in the 1890s, a little bit before that. But I think that clearly the later paintings, the ones that are really big and gestural, in part, one could argue that they were made because he just couldn't see. That he was just making these gestures and almost feeling his way, around these canvases. But, in terms of I don't think he ever forgot these things, and I think these things were in the back, somewhere in the back of his mind or the back of his eye, when he was doing these very late paintings when he could hardly see.
Okay. And we only have time for a couple more.
I sort of hate to stay on the subject of the glass, but that was going to be
all
my
right.
question.
That's a good one.
I was wondering are they left under glass or are they just under glass
Yes.
during the exhibit? I thought glass was bad for an oil painting. But
No, it's not. We do leave them under glass. And another reason I'll just give you for putting paintings under glass is that many paintings are in what we call a micro environment. And what that means is that sometimes there's actually a steel tray that's underneath the painting, which you can't see. The painting is mounted in the steel tray, and then the glass is put on top, and it's kind of sealed. And so when we lend paintings, for example, we lent our Monet Houses of Parliament to a show. Well, it's currently on loan, in fact. It's in Grenoble, France right now. But when we lent it to a show in Geneva, to a small museum, which didn't have very good climate control, we wanted our painting to be in this microclimate, because once it's kind of sealed into this metal box, it will respond to temperature outside, and it will respond to humidity. But the adjustment, the way that the temperature and the humidity affect the painting is much slower, because it's in this sealed environment, basically. And so another reason that museums put glass on paintings is to create this kind of micro-environment. So if there is a change in humidity, and frankly, it's something that humidity is a major element in Atlanta, for those of you who didn't know that. But it is something that really affects works of art. And if you've seen works on paper, for example, you get a dry period and a wet period, and it starts to get wavy. That's a result of those changes. So one simple thing that you can do with a work on paper, for example, which you would almost always put behind glass, is actually seal the back with paper. And again, in a way, you're creating this micro environment, which is keeping out some of that moisture and some of those changes in temperature, those dramatic changes. Yes.
Are there special trucks and containers to ship these paintings? Like humidity-controlled trucks, security?
Yes.
I don't think you do it by FedEx, but do you like Brinks trucks? Or,
you're
transporting $100 million of the paintings.
Well, I'll make a special plug for two exhibition sponsors that we work with. We work very closely with Delta and with UPS. And both of them have shipped works of art to Atlanta safely, and, knock on laminate. Basically we make sure that when the works of art are either loaded onto trucks or loaded onto airplanes, that they're very carefully packed. There have been amazing changes in truck, sort of technology, and you can now have really great climate control, and you can also have trucks that have a little less impact when the truck hits bumps in the road. Than previous trucks. But yeah, we truck, we fly. If things come from overseas, we fly them. In my experience, we've never shipped a work of art via ship. be a boat. But we thought about it with the big Napoleon, the lead Napoleon. We thought about putting him on a boat, but it takes a really long time, and it would have to go to Savannah, and then, So we tend to fly those things, and the planes they're huge planes. They can take, we flew the Tiber, which is, I think, 5 tons, 6 tons, 10 tons, I have no idea, of marble. That flew in a cargo plane. I think UPS plane brought that, so, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. That's all we have time for
Thank you.
this evening. So we'll see you next week.
Thank you.